When Soviet engineers tilted the T-34's armor at a 45-degree angle, they created a tank that could deflect the feared German 88mm shells, a weapon that had destroyed everything in its path until that moment. In the frozen fields of Russia, Panzer commanders went silent as their shells ricocheted harmlessly off Soviet armor. This is the story of how a simple geometric principle changed the course of armored warfare forever. 1943 was a pivotal year on the Eastern Front. The might of Nazi Germany's Panzer divisions had been halted at Stalingrad, and now the Soviet forces were beginning to push back. But in the workshops of Kharkov Tank Factory Number 183, a revolution in armored warfare was taking place, far from the front lines. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mikhail Koshkin was not what you'd call an imposing man. Short in stature with round glasses that seemed too large for his face, he didn't look like someone who would change the face of warfare. But appearances can be deceiving. What Koshkin lacked in physical presence, he made up for with a brilliant engineering mind and an unwavering determination. As chief designer at the Kharkov factory, Koshkin had been tasked with solving an impossible problem: how to create a tank that could withstand the devastating German 88mm anti-aircraft gun that had been repurposed for anti-tank warfare. The 88, as it was commonly known, had earned a fearsome reputation. Soviet tankers called it the Widowmaker, for good reason. No Soviet armor could withstand a direct hit. Winter had settled over Kharkov, and the factory workers huddled around small stoves between shifts. Their breath visible in the frigid air, they worked tirelessly, knowing that every tank that rolled off their production line meant lives saved at the front. Koshkin spent countless nights at his drafting table, sketching designs and running calculations, often forgetting to eat or sleep. One particularly cold night in December 1940, as snow piled against the factory windows, Koshkin was studying ballistics reports from the front lines. The data was grim. Even their newest tanks were being picked off at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters by the German 88 seconds. No amount of conventional armor could solve this problem. Adding more steel meant adding more weight, reducing speed and maneuverability, making the tanks easier targets. Koshkin pushed his glasses up on his nose and reached for his cup of tea, now long cold. That's when it happened, a moment of inspiration that would change everything. As he set the cup down, it slipped on the smooth surface of a technical manual, sliding across at an angle. The tea spilled, forming a diagonal line across his ballistics charts. Staring at the angled line cutting across his work, Koshkin suddenly saw the solution with perfect clarity. It wasn't about making the armor thicker, it was about making it smarter. "It's not the thickness," he whispered to himself. "It's the angle." Basic geometry told him that a shell striking armor at an angle had to penetrate more material than one hitting head-on. If they angled the armor at 45 degrees, a shell would effectively have to penetrate almost 4 times the actual thickness of the plate. But more importantly, at the right angle, shells might deflect entirely, bouncing off instead of penetrating. The next morning, Koshkin called his team together. Among them was Alexander Morozov, his talented deputy, and Nikolai Kucherenko, their chief production engineer. Their breath formed clouds in the cold morning air as Koshkin excitedly explained his revelation. "Gentlemen, we've been approaching this all wrong," he said, sketching rapidly on the blackboard. "We've been trying to stop the German shells. Instead, we need to make them slide off." Morozov, always the pragmatist, raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting we angle all the armor plates?" Koshkin nodded. "At 45 degrees, the mathematics is clear. Even the 88mm shell would struggle against properly angled armor of sufficient quality." Kucherenko frowned. "The production challenges would be enormous. We'd have to redesign our entire manufacturing process." "Then we redesign it," Koshkin said firmly. "The lives of our tankers depend on it." What followed was a period of frantic work. Koshkin's team worked around the clock, redesigning what would become the T-34 with its revolutionary sloped armor. The front glacis plate would be angled at precisely 45 degrees, the optimal angle for deflection without compromising interior space. Testing began in early 1941 with prototype armor plates. At the proving grounds outside Kharkov, they set up captured German 88mm guns and prepared to test Koshkin's theory. A crowd gathered engineers, factory workers, and several high-ranking military officials who had come to witness what Koshkin had promised would be a breakthrough. The first test was conducted at 800 meters, a range where the 88 typically penetrated any known tank armor with ease. The test plate, angled at 45 degrees and made of hardened steel, was mounted on a concrete block. The German gun fired. The sound echoed across the proving grounds like thunder. Everyone waited for the inevitable, the shell punching through the plate as it had done countless times before. But something different happened. The shell struck the angled plate and ricocheted upward with a screeching sound, flying off into the distance before exploding harmlessly several hundred meters away. For a moment, there was silence. Then the crowd erupted in cheers. Koshkin stood motionless, tears welling in his eyes. It had worked exactly as he had calculated. More tests followed. They fired at different ranges, different angles. The results were consistent. At the critical 45-degree angle, shells that would have punched through twice the thickness of conventional armor simply deflected away. Colonel Vasily Tikhonov, a battle-hardened tank commander who had lost 2 tanks to German 88 seconds, approached Koshkin after the tests. His face, scarred from burns sustained in combat, was solemn. "If we had this 6 months ago, I'd still have my crew," he said quietly. "How soon can you put this into production?" "We're already retooling the factory," Koshkin replied. "The first T-34 seconds with the new armor will be rolling off the line within months." What neither man knew was that time was not on their side. Just 3 months later, on the 22nd of June 1941, Nazi Germany would launch Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The greatest tank battle in history was about to begin, and the T-34 would be thrust into combat before full production could be achieved. Koshkin didn't live to see his creation in full-scale battle. Having fallen ill during harsh field tests, he died of pneumonia in September 1941. His last words to Morozov were simple. "Make sure they understand the angle. 45 degrees. Not 40, not 50. 45. By early 1942, the T-34 was being produced in significant numbers, despite the chaos of wartime evacuation, as factories were moved east beyond the reach of German bombers. The tanks were often driven straight from the factory floor to the front lines, their engines barely broken in, paint still wet. Meanwhile, on the front lines, German Panzer commanders were in for a shock. Hauptmann Klaus Brenner had commanded Panzers since the Polish campaign in 1939. His company of Panzer IV tanks had cut through Polish, French, and early Soviet armor with ease. The 88mm gun mounted on the new Tiger tanks was considered unstoppable. On a misty morning near Kursk in July 1943, Brenner's company lay in wait for a Soviet armored column reported to be moving their way. Through his binoculars, he spotted the first T-34 seconds emerging from the tree line, their distinctive, silhouettes unmistakable with that sharply angled front armor. "Target, lead tank, range 1,200 meters. Brenner ordered his gunner. The 88mm gun roared. Brenner watched confidently, expecting to see the familiar flash and smoke of a penetration and kill. Instead, to his astonishment, he saw the shell strike the angled front plate of the T-34 and deflect upward, leaving only a scar on the Soviet tank's armor. "Impossible," he muttered. "Fire again." 3 more shells were fired. 3 more ricochets. The T-34 continued advancing, apparently undamaged, its own 76mm gun now training on Brenner's position. "All tanks, fall back to secondary positions," Brenner ordered, a note of panic in his voice for the first time in his combat career. As his Panzer reversed behind a ridge, he radioed headquarters with an urgent message. "Engaging new Soviet tank model, frontal armor deflecting our shells. Request immediate instructions." Back at German High Command, Brenner's report was one of dozens suddenly flooding in from the Eastern Front. General Heinz Guderian, the father of Germany's Panzer forces, called an emergency meeting of tank designers and commanders. "Gentlemen, we face a crisis," Guderian began, spreading out reconnaissance photos of the T-34. "The Russians have developed something our intelligence missed completely. Their new tanks feature sloped armor that our shells cannot penetrate frontally, even at close range." Ferdinand Porsche, one of Germany's leading tank designers, studied the photos with growing concern. "The slope is the key. It's so simple, yet so effective. We should have thought of this." "Can we modify our existing tanks?" Guderian asked. "Not easily," Porsche admitted. "Our designs would require complete rethinking. This isn't a minor adjustment, it's a fundamental design principle we've overlooked." Word of the T-34's seemingly magical ability to shrug off German shells spread quickly among the Wehrmacht. Morale among Panzer crews, previously sky-high, began to falter. Tank commanders were instructed to aim for the tracks or try to flank the T-34 seconds to hit their less angled side armor, a dangerous proposition given the Soviet tank's superior mobility. In a German field hospital near Orel, wounded Panzer gunner Otto Müller described the psychological impact to a war correspondent. "We've always believed our tanks were the best in the world, our guns unstoppable. Then suddenly we're facing these Soviet tanks that make our shells bounce off like they're made of rubber. It's like the rules of war changed overnight, and nobody told us." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By late 1943, the psychological advantage was shifting decisively. German tank crews, once confident in their technical superiority, now approached engagements with Soviet armor with trepidation. The fear was so pronounced that some panzer units began avoiding direct confrontation with T-34 formations, preferring to set ambushes or call in air support rather than engage tank to tank. Back in the Soviet Union, production of the T-34 had reached astounding levels. The simplicity of its sloped armor design made it easier to manufacture than comparable German tanks. While a Tiger tank required 300,000 man-hours to produce, a T-34 needed only 8,000. Soviet factories were producing 1,200 tons, 34 seconds per month, by mid-1943, overwhelming German production capabilities. Sergeant Ivan Dmitriev had been a factory worker before the war. Now he commanded a T-34 inches, the 5th Guards Tank Army. Having survived 3 years of brutal combat, he had developed an almost superstitious attachment to his tank's sloped armor. "Before each battle, I would run my hand along the front plate, feeling the perfect angle," he later recalled in his memoirs. "I'd lost 2 tanks early in the war, before the T-34. But in this one, with its sloped armor, I survived 14 direct hits from German guns. My crew called our tank the Deflector. We painted the number of bounced shells on the turret. By the time we reached Berlin, we had 23 marks. In February 1944, a captured German panzer officer, Major Wilhelm Strasser, was interrogated by Soviet intelligence. His assessment was blunt. The sloped armor of the T-34 changed everything. It wasn't just the physical protection it offered, but the psychological impact. When you fire what you know is a killing shot and watch it bounce off harmlessly, something breaks inside you. You begin to question everything you've been told about your technical superiority. As the Red Army pushed westward toward Germany, the legend of the T-34's impenetrable front armor grew. Soviet propaganda films showed dramatic footage of German shells ricocheting off the sloped plates. One famous sequence, filmed during the Battle of Kursk, showed a T-34 advancing through a hail of German fire, shells visibly bouncing off its angled armor, a seemingly unstoppable force. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, addressing Soviet tank crews before the Berlin offensive in April 1945, referenced the psychological advantage directly. "Your T-34 seconds have become the nightmare of German tank commanders. They fear what they cannot kill. The simple genius of that 45-degree angle has saved thousands of your lives and will carry you all the way to Berlin." In the war's final months, German industry desperately tried to incorporate sloped armor into their own designs, but it was too late. The Panther tank, Germany's answer to the T-34, did feature angled armor, but production problems and material shortages meant it never reached the numbers needed to turn the tide. When Berlin finally fell in May 1945, T-34 seconds, with their distinctive sloped frontal armor, were among the first vehicles to reach the Reichstag. In one iconic photograph, a T-34 stands before the ruined German parliament building, its angled glacis plate, bearing the scars of at least 7 direct hits, yet still intact. After the war, military historians would debate the factors that led to Allied victory. While many elements contributed, from American industrial might to Soviet manpower, few disagreed with British military historian Sir Basil Liddell Hart's assessment. The T-34's sloped armor represented one of the war's most significant technological innovations, a simple geometric principle that provided psychological as well as physical protection and helped turn the tide on the Eastern Front. In his final report before retirement, General Guderian wrote, "We failed to recognize the importance of sloped armor until it was demonstrated against us in combat. This oversight cost Germany dearly. While we pursued complex engineering solutions, the Soviets employed basic principles of physics to devastating effect." Mikhail Koshkin never lived to see his design vindicate itself on the battlefield, or to know that his simple insight about angling armor at 45 degrees would save countless lives and help defeat the Nazi war machine. But his legacy lived on in every T-34 that survived a direct hit from a German 88mm shell, in every Soviet tanker who returned home because a shell ricocheted instead of penetrating. Today, at tank museums around the world, visitors still marvel at the elegant simplicity of the T-34's sloped armor. Children run their hands along the 45-degree angle of the front glacis plate, feeling the same surface that once deflected the most powerful anti-tank shells of World War II. What they're touching isn't just steel, it's the physical embodiment of a principle that changed armored warfare forever. In the decades after the war, the T-34's influence spread far beyond the Soviet Union. Military engineers from the United States, Britain, France, and dozens of other nations incorporated angled armor into their tank designs. The American M48 Patton, the British Centurion, the French AMX-30 all featured sloped armor inspired directly by the T-34. Colonel Robert Erickson of the U.S. Army Armor School at Fort Knox kept a small-scale model of a T-34 on his desk for 40 years. When new cadets would ask about it, he'd tell them, "This is what happens when someone thinks differently about a problem everyone else has accepted as unsolvable." One geometric insight, changing the angle of armor to 45 degrees, saved more Soviet lives than any other single design decision in the war. But perhaps the most telling testament to the T-34's psychological impact comes from the memories of those who faced it in combat. Hans Weber, a former Tiger tank commander who settled in Munich after the war, rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. But in 1978, during an interview for a German documentary, he made a remarkable admission. "The first time I saw my shell bounce off a T-34, I felt something I had never experienced before in the war, pure helplessness," Weber said. "We had been told our Tigers were invincible, that our 88mm guns could destroy any tank on the battlefield. Then, suddenly, we were facing these Soviet tanks with their sharply angled fronts, watching our shells ricochet harmlessly into the sky. The sound still haunts my dreams, that metallic screech as the shell deflected. That was the moment many of us realized the war might be lost." The psychological impact of the T-34's sloped armor extended well beyond individual tank crews. It reached all the way to Hitler himself. In recently declassified transcripts of military conferences from late 1943, Hitler can be heard raging about the failure of German tank designers to anticipate the Soviet innovation. "How could something so simple have escaped us?" Hitler demanded of Albert Speer, his Minister of Armaments. "A child understands that a ball bounces off a surface at an angle. Yet, our greatest engineers failed to apply this principle to tank armor before the Russians showed it to us." Speer, in his post-war memoirs, wrote that the T-34's sloped armor represented one of Hitler's greatest obsessions during the later war years. He would sometimes interrupt discussions of grand strategy to return to the subject of the T-34's angled armor, as if this single design feature symbolized for him everything that was going wrong on the Eastern Front. The impact of the T-34's design innovation went beyond military considerations. For the Soviet people, the tank became a symbol of their technological ingenuity, triumphing over German engineering, which had been widely considered superior before the war. In 1944, as Soviet forces pushed westward, a propaganda poster appeared throughout the USSR. It showed a T-34 with German shells bouncing off its sloped armor. The caption read, "German superiority meets Soviet ingenuity." The message was clear through clever thinking. Soviet designers had outwitted their supposedly more advanced German counterparts. This narrative gained further strength when captured German documents revealed that Panzer commanders had begun warning their crews not to engage T-34 seconds frontally. A translated German tactical manual from late 1943 instructed, "When encountering T-34 tanks, avoid direct frontal engagement. The sloped frontal armor will deflect even our most powerful shells. Attempt to maneuver for side shots where armor is less effectively angled." For Soviet tankers who had spent the early war years feeling technologically outmatched, finding these documents was vindicating. As veteran T-34 commander Leonid Brezhnev, who would later become Soviet leader, recalled in his memoirs, "Reading captured German tactical manuals that told their tank commanders to fear our T-34 seconds gave us a fierce pride. They had started the war believing us to be inferior in every way. Now they were writing training manuals about how to avoid our tanks." The story of the T-34's sloped armor also reveals how innovation often emerges from necessity rather than abundance. The Soviet Union, with fewer industrial resources than Germany, couldn't simply make thicker armor. They had to make smarter armor. Dr. Elena Koroleva, historian at the Moscow Military Museum, puts it this way: "The T-34 represents a particular kind of innovation that emerges under constraints. The Soviets couldn't match German manufacturing precision or metallurgical quality, so they created a design that didn't require either. The genius of the sloped armor was that it worked even with lower quality steel, because the geometric principle was doing much of the protective work." This lesson wasn't lost on post-war military planners. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, after becoming NATO's first supreme Allied commander in Europe, specifically cited the T-34's design philosophy in a 1951 memo to Alliance defense ministers. "We must learn from the Soviet experience with the T-34. Sometimes the most effective solution isn't the most technologically sophisticated one. Elegant simplicity often trumps complex engineering, especially when resources are limited and production speed is critical." The human stories behind the T-34's development are equally compelling. After Mikhail Koshkin's death in 1941, his deputy Alexander Morozov took over the continuing evolution of the T-34 design. Morozov had been skeptical of Koshkin's 45-degree armor concept initially, arguing for a more conventional approach. Later, he would keep a photograph of Koshkin on his office wall for the rest of his career. "Every time we faced a difficult design decision," Morozov wrote in 1970, "I would look at Mikhail's picture and ask myself, what would Koshkin do? The answer was always the same: find the elegant solution, the one that looks obvious only after someone has shown it to you." The workers who built the T-34 seconds under extraordinary conditions deserve equal recognition. When the German advance threatened the Kharkov Tank Factory in October 1941, the entire facility, machines, equipment, and 15,000 workers with their families was evacuated to Nizhny Tagil in the Ural Mountains. Within weeks, they were producing tanks again, often working in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees. Natalia Petrova was just 16 when she began working at the evacuated factory. 70 years later, she still remembered the pride she felt in the T-34's sloped armor. "We knew what we were building was special," she recalled in a 2010 interview. "The older workers who had seen the test results would tell us, every degree matters. The angle must be exactly 45 degrees, no more, no less. German shells will bounce off like raindrops." When reports came back from the front confirming this, we worked even harder. The impact of the T-34's sloped armor extended well beyond World War II. During the Korean War, American tank crews encountered T-34 85 seconds, an upgraded version used by North Korean forces. Despite having newer M26 Pershing tanks, some U.S. crews reported the same psychological shock that German tankers had experienced when their shells ricocheted off the T-34's frontal armor. Lieutenant Samuel Harris, commanding an M26 Pershing in Korea in 1950, wrote in his after-action report, "My gunner put a shell dead center on the front plate of a T-34 at 800 yards. We watched in disbelief as it bounced off. He fired again with the same result. The deflection angle saved that North Korean tank and crew. We eventually knocked it out with a flank shot, but the experience was unnerving. I had assured my men our 90mm gun could punch through anything the communists had. By the 1,950 seconds, every major tank design worldwide incorporated sloped armor. The principle had become so fundamental that military historians often divide tank design history into pre-sloped armor and post-sloped armor eras. What had seemed revolutionary in 1941 had become standard practice by 1951, the ultimate testament to the T-34's influence. Perhaps the most poignant epilogue to the story came in 1989, when German and Soviet veterans of the Battle of Kursk gathered for a reconciliation ceremony on the battle's 45th anniversary. Among them were former T-34 commander Dmitry Loza and ex-Tiger commander Kurt Meyer. The two men, once mortal enemies, embraced at the ceremony. Afterward, they walked together to examine a preserved T-34 on display. Meyer ran his hand along the 45-degree sloped frontal armor, feeling the still visible scars where German shells had deflected decades earlier. "This simple angle caused us so much trouble," he said quietly. "So much brilliant engineering in our Tigers, yet we couldn't solve the problem of this clever slope." Loza nodded. Koshkin used to say that the best solutions are often the simplest ones. A change in angle, that's all it took. "Your Koshkin was a genius," Meyer admitted. "Sometimes I think if we had spent less time making our tanks more complicated and more time making them smarter, like this one, history might have been different." The two old soldiers stood in silence for a moment, united in their appreciation for the elegant simplicity of the T-34's design. Two former enemies finding common ground in their respect for engineering brilliance, perhaps the most fitting tribute to Mikhail Koshkin's legacy. The principle of sloped armor continues to influence military design today. Modern battle tanks still incorporate angled surfaces, although now combined with composite and reactive armor technologies undreamed of in the 1,940 seconds. Yet the basic geometric insight remains the same. An angled surface increases effective armor thickness and promotes shell deflection. At the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow, visitors can see a remarkable artifact, a T-34 recovered from a swamp near Leningrad in the 1,990 seconds. The tank had been knocked out during fighting in 1944, not by a direct penetration, but after its tracks were damaged by artillery fire. What makes this particular T-34 extraordinary is the front glacis plate, which bears the scars of 17 direct hits from German anti-tank weapons, none of which penetrated. Museum curator Alexei Kodarev uses this tank in his tours to demonstrate the effectiveness of sloped armor. "Look closely at these impact marks," he tells visitors. "You can see how the German shells struck the armor and then deflected upward, leaving only scars in the steel. The 5-man crew inside this tank survived all 17 hits because of this 45-degree angle. It's not just a design feature, it's the reason 5 men went home to their families." For tank designer Yuri Pashalok, who has studied the T-34 extensively, Koshkin's insight represents something more universal. "The T-34's sloped armor teaches us something about innovation itself," he says. "True breakthroughs often don't require new technologies or materials. Sometimes they just require looking at an old problem from a new angle, literally." In this case, Koshkin didn't invent a new type of steel or a new manufacturing process. He simply tilted the armor and changed armored warfare forever. The human dimension of this technological story is perhaps best captured in the words of Pyotr Ivanovich, who served as a T-34 driver from Stalingrad to Berlin. In a 1975 interview, when asked what he remembered most about his wartime experience, he didn't talk about battles or victories. "What I remember most was the sound," he said. "The sound of German shells hitting our sloped front armor and deflecting away. It wasn't the sound of the impact that was remarkable, it was what came after. Inside the tank, we would hear the shell hit with a tremendous bang, but then, instead of explosion and death, there would be this strange screech as the shell ricocheted away. Then, silence. Then, a moment later, the voices of my crew, still alive, still fighting." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. That sound, the sound of a deflected shell, followed by the voices of my friends still alive, that was the sound of Koshkin's 45-degree angle. That was the sound of geometry saving lives. The legacy of the T-34's sloped armor extends beyond military history into the philosophy of design itself. Modern engineers in fields from automotive safety to architecture still study the T-34 as a case study in elegant problem-solving. The principle is always the same. Sometimes the most powerful innovations are not the most complex, but the most insightful. At the tank school in Kazan, where Russian armor crews still train today, there stands a simple monument, a slab of steel set at precisely 45 degrees, with a quote from Mikhail Koshkin engraved upon it. "Look at old problems from new angles, and you may find the solution has been hiding in plain sight all along." The true measure of the T-34's psychological impact may be this. More than 75 years after Koshkin's insight, the 45-degree sloped armor of the T-34 remains one of the most instantly recognizable silhouettes in military history. Not because it was the biggest tank, or the most powerful, or even the most technologically sophisticated, but because it embodied an idea so powerful in its simplicity that it changed the psychological dynamics of armored warfare. In an age of increasing technological complexity, perhaps that's the most valuable lesson the T-34 still teaches us. Innovation isn't always about adding complexity. Sometimes it's about finding the elegant angle that transforms a problem entirely. As for Mikhail Koshkin, he never lived to see his design change the course of the war or enter the pantheon of military legends. He died believing his work might have been in vain, as the German advance seemed unstoppable in those dark days of 1941. He couldn't know that his insight about a 45-degree angle would help turn the tide of the largest conflict in human history. In 2018, at a ceremony marking the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Kursk, an elderly man approached a display, featuring a T-34 tank. He moved slowly, leaning on a cane, his chest bearing rows of medals. The museum staff recognized him immediately. Dmitry Loza, 94 years old, one of the last surviving T-34 commanders from World War II. Loza stood before the tank in silence for several minutes, then reached out a trembling hand to touch the sloped frontal armor. A young boy watching nearby asked his father why the old man was touching the tank that way. "Because that tank saved his life," the father explained. Overhearing this, Loza turned to them with tears in his eyes. "Not just my life," he said. "This tank, with its sloped armor, saved thousands of lives, and it all came from one man looking at a problem differently." He patted the angled steel one last time. Sometimes the difference between life and death, between victory and defeat, is just a matter of finding the right angle. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.